context and location dependent, right? And the topic that we'll be discussing today, which is Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the perceptions on the world, on the war in Ukraine, have a lot to say or to do with the place you look at this war from, right? It's not the same reading the importance and the impact of the Ukraine war from, of course, Europe, than seeing it from China, seeing it from Latin America, seeing it from DC or from many other locations around the world. So the purpose today of this discussion is precisely to look at the war in Ukraine, but from what we could call a global South perspective, right? Global South in itself is a term that we can problematize, right? And that we can discuss whether it makes sense at all to speak about the global South. There are other expressions for the same concept. Some call it the plural South, or many other ways of describing this complex number of actors and countries that form or that are part of the so-called global South. But in any case, what we wanted to do today is to have a discussion on the war in Ukraine and international politics and international security from the perspective of, if we agree, what we could call the global South. Because most of the time what we keep hearing from, and let's accept it, okay, we discuss about the global South for the time being. Most of the time what we keep hearing is the global South is very important, it's increasingly important when it comes to the share of the GDP that it gathers, the countries of the global South and their impact on international economy and politics. Let me just give you a few figures here to make the case for that point, right? By 2030, 3 of the 4 largest economies in the world will be in the global South, right? If we include China in the global South, which is another question mark, China, India, and Indonesia will represent these 3 largest economies by 2030. And if we look at 2050, 7 of the 10th largest economies will be from the global South, right? So that means that the share of the GDP of the global South, and with it comes the importance in global economy and global politics, has increased very dramatically for the last few decades, right? We were about 20% of the global GDP about 3 decades ago, and now the global South represents about more than 40% of the GDP, right? So with the presence of the global South in the economy, of course, comes one very important share of the, what we could call the material power in global politics, right? Economy is an important source of material power for many, many countries, and that includes countries of the global South. But with this material power comes other sort of powers, which include also military power, right? Or diplomatic power. All these shares of power are making the global South also increasingly important. But it's not only about the material sources of power, it's also about the, what we could call the ideational sources of power, or the power of ideas. Which sort of ideas will be prominent or will be part of the global discussion if the material sources of power also change, right? You have the power of ideas sometimes because you have the power of resources, and vice versa. You have the power of resources because you also shape the ideas of the world, right? And all this sort of discussion is, as we speak, taking a lot of interest from different voices around the globe by making the discussion on the state of global affairs much more plural, much more complex, much more necessary to be discussed and disputed, right? And this is the idea of today's session. The idea is to depart from this premise. Power is changing, material power and ideational power is changing, and this means that we discuss about similar events from different perspectives, right? This is what we are trying to do today. The event is part of a broader project that we've been undertaking for the last few months or years, which is part of our DigiDem EU project, which is a project related to how to engage with citizens and the topics of citizens in global politics and how to have a more plural discussion on global politics. This event is part of that endeavor, but also part of a discussion that we'll be having tomorrow, also going a bit more into detail about the impact, the global implications of the war in Ukraine from this global South perspective. And for that, we've gathered three very authoritative voices on this topic, and I'm very happy, as I said at the beginning, that you decided to travel to Barcelona to share your views on this. And I will introduce them to you, to the audience. On my left side, we have Len Ismail, who is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, a center based in Morocco, not only Morocco, but in other parts, but with whom we've had a lot of contacts, precisely showcasing the importance to speak about African realities in global politics as well. And on that, we've worked together with some of Len's colleagues, although she comes from Washington today, so very grateful that you made the effort. Then further left, we have Yan Xiaohua, if I pronounce it more or less correctly, who is an associate professor and deputy director of the Center for China-Europe Relations at Fudan University, coming from Shanghai. So very grateful that you also accepted our invitation. And on my right side, we have Philani Mtembu, with whom we've also collaborated in the past, who's executive director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, coming from South Africa. So thank you very much to the three of you. What we'll be having is a short introductory remarks from your side, and then we'll engage into a bit of a conversation among the four of us, and then we'll open for questions from the audience. So Len, the first floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's a pleasure to be able to have accepted your invitation to be here in this very beautiful city of Barcelona that I have been several times before as a former ambassador representing a number of countries to the EU and member states of the EU as well. Before I really dive down into part of the conversation that we have to have this afternoon, because these are extraordinary and very, very interesting times, and that would be a bit of an understatement, I would say. But I arrived yesterday when Barcelona and Catalonians were celebrating the Day of St. George, full of love and flowers, and I was very impressed. The men were carrying the flowers for the ladies too, and I liked that very, very much. But it was quite a wonderful spirit to be part of that yesterday, quite unexpectedly, actually. And I thought, what a lovely atmosphere, where we can talk and think about love, not war, and culture and books and all the things that excite us. It allowed me to think back a little bit later, or earlier, shall I say, to the culture in the US of the hippies, the flower children, make love, not war. They wanted peace. That was very much a generational thing. And then if we go back, and other things as well, of course. But if we go back right after the Second World War, here in Europe and other parts of the world as well, we had countries that came together exhausted by war. And they had very much a sensibility that they could not go through war anymore. And they had aspirations and a vision of something very, very different and compelling for the world, based on a series of what I will call ideals and idealism, shared prosperity for all, greater equality. And so they started talking about the institutional framework, they started talking about liberalism, they started talking about trade as a vehicle of development. And of course, we have had, not evenly of course, but for the last 70 years, we've had remarkable stability across the world, and shared prosperity as well. Today, however, we face different sets of circumstances. We're no longer talking about that vision. We're no longer talking about idealism. I think we're facing a situation based much more on realism and raw power politics. And in a sense, this is part of why we're here today, to talk about war. And if I step back a little bit before really going into the points that I would like to address, the two quick things I want to say just as a prelude would be, the first thing was that we're here to talk about the war in Ukraine, but I would argue, Paul, that the war in Ukraine is just one episode in a series of crises. It may have been the tipping point in some ways, but it's still just one in a series of crises that we will discuss. And the second, of course, is that as of this moment, just 3 months ago, we have a new administration in America that has gone about its way of expressing its sovereignty, as it has the right to do, in a different way, in a very unilateral way. That has added another layer of complexity to the world of crises that I think we can all agree is very much part of the landscape, that we should situate the conversation about Ukraine and the different perceptions of the war in Ukraine around the world. So I think it would be fair to say that the last 15 years have been a series of crises. In 2008, 2009, we had the financial crisis, the subprime crisis that had perhaps its epicenter in New York, but the entire world was affected, and so was Europe, particularly the southern part of Europe. Here in Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and you know what you faced. But we also had crises for the global economy, including COVID in 2019. Then we had the war that no one expected. Well, that's not entirely true, but we don't need to go into that either. But then we had the war in Ukraine. And then, of course, right after that, we had the war in Gaza. Disproportionately affected, I would argue, have been countries of the South. They have paid a very big price, not because they are directly involved in the war, but because they are poor, more vulnerable, without a cushion. And so their interest is not war. The war that we thought might have ended in 2 weeks is now in its third year. And the whole world has been touched one way or another by it. Here in Europe, the conversation about that war is very different to the conversation about the war that we will find in Latin America or Africa or other parts of the world like that. The World Bank has warned of a decade of lost development for countries of the South. In parts of Africa, and I know that you will speak about that, in parts of Africa, poverty is not going down, it is increasing. The SDGs are only 17% of perhaps being on target to be met, 17. And there's been complete disruption of global supply chains. And now today we're also talking, not today, let's say before January, we were already talking about decoupling, de-risking from China, all of this compounding the issues and the problems facing the rest of the world. Questions of food security for the global South. Their combined debt has increased by more than 35%, and we have all witnessed the news of sovereign debt collapse, and we know what happens. We saw the chaos on the street in Sri Lanka when that government approached that debt. And one of the things I suspect that is lacking in a type of understanding of the differences between the West and the global South is that whereas the West might consider a threat as being military or being a diminishing of influence, for the global South, it's about development, not being able to meet the aspirations of the people of whom governments are responsible for. And that threat of political and economic and social instability is a very, very real one. And that is what they are most concerned about, which is why development is important to them. Tensions in the international community were always there, but I think COVID added another layer to those tensions because there was an original thought that we were all in this together for COVID. The managing director of the IMF in fact, gave advice to all developing countries to borrow as much as they could to be able to pay for recovery when recovery came. And countries did that. But we were not we were not in it all together, as we found out. Schengen borders were closed. Global South countries waited for years for the first vaccines. And when they came, actually, they came from China, they came from India, they also came from Russia. Okay? There are grievances upon grievances that are layered, perhaps which also inform the differences in perception. 2022 was supposed to be the year of recovery. We didn't have recovery. We had a war that we hope will come to an end, but it seems to be unending. And countries of the Global South continue to be disproportionately affected by it, which is why they have no interest in the war. Not because they don't think that territorial integrity is important. They abide by that. But they do not feel that their interests are being served, or many countries of the world's interests are being served by this war at this particular point in time. And while the war in Ukraine might have been a tipping point in terms of the division between the West and the rest of the world, I think Gaza was a particularly painful point of departure for countries in the North and countries of the South. One, I think even with the Ukraine, Global South countries understood that there was a difference in treatment of migration. That became something that was very important as well. But on the matter of sanctions, there was a view that sanctions very much could be used unilaterally by the West against the rest of the world if, in fact, countries did not step up to the plate or align with what was expected of them. I'm not making any argument or judgment on whether sanctions are right or not, but I will give one example, that in the case of Venezuela, where 7.9 million Venezuelans were displaced as a result of sanctions on Maduro. And these people paid a big price during COVID because they had no healthcare systems. But when in Europe we wanted to reduce dependency on oil and gas from Russia, what did we do? We dusted Maduro, we brought him in from the coal, and all of a sudden it was okay to start exporting gas and oil. So if sanctions for the Global South are viewed as a pivot that we can turn on and turn off, then countries of the Global South see that at any moment, any one of them can in fact be headed for that same sort of treatment. They also felt, therefore, that in the matter of Russia and sanctions, that there was no need for them to be engaged in implementing those sanctions because the sanctions were did not arrive as a result of the United Nations. They were unilaterally arrived. Now, two last quick things that I will say. I think that it brings home a few perceptions from the Global South. The one is that all countries have interest, even those that are small and those that are poor. It's just that they have to manage those interests in a different way. But for the very first time, we get a sense that Western interests were no longer de facto those of the rest of the world, in which 85% of the world's people live. We get a sense, too, that Western institutions that were in place and were established for very good reasons right after the war were no longer fit for purpose for some of the reasons that you have already spoken about, that Western leadership is being contested, and Western values no longer have the moral clarity that they once had. Why, and why now? And just 3 points. Why now? Why is the Global South suddenly acting that way very blatantly, very openly in their own interest? One, because they can. Today, they can. You have spoken about some of the reasons why they can. We have the rise of middle powers, like Turkey, like Brazil, the Saudis, the Gulf states among them. We have global wealth and output that has shifted from west to east, not is shifting, but has shifted, and you have given us some very important numbers for that. But if you looked at the United States, in 1960, it was responsible for 40% of global output. By 2021, it was 25%, and it is going down. The EU was 25% in 1990. It will be 11% in 2024. India is already the world's 5th largest population. The EU will be equal to India by 2040, below the US of 14%, and less than half the economy of China. And China is today a superpower. Since COVID, countries of the Global South have been taking matters in their own hands. What are they doing? They are deepening arrangements within themselves to secure their interests. They're increasingly members of the BRICS, and of SCO, they're lining up to be members. They are bypassing SWIFT. They are building cross-border platforms. They are trading in their own currency. They are putting in place currency swaps. What, in fact, they are doing is hedging their bets. They want to be sure that if sanctions are unilaterally imposed on them, that they have other means of paying for their debts, other trade routes, and they are building new trade routes. And I'll just give you 2 quick examples. If we think of the Southern Atlantic, you know, we usually don't think of it in terms of legal flows of things. It started even with the slave trade, okay? But when we take a look at the Southern Atlantic, we think of drug trafficking, guns, people smuggling, all of those things. But not today. You have Morocco actively building new ports to be able to trade directly with Latin America. You have big new ports built and funded by China in Latin America, in Peru, that will now provide access directly to Asia, reducing traffic time by 25 days. Right? Those things are being built upon in a very, very good way. They have more choice because of the rise of middle powers, and global South countries are now exercising multi-alignment. They refuse to choose one side or another. And then to conclude, I think that there is a sense that war in Ukraine was the tipping point. I think events in the Middle East, a rebalancing of power, are very, very important to note. And I say that I think it's fair to say that America first interests right now for Europe are very, very compelling, and they are a game changer and have implications for the rest of the world. And 3 points, and I end because I have said a lot. 3 quick points. One, why is it a game changer? Because for the first time, we see a wedge in the transatlantic relationship and in the Western solidarity that has been there for a very long time. That provides opportunities for others. I think the EU has lost a lot of its soft power in the last 5 years, let's say. It can be even further than that. For the EU to regain its voice, what does it need to do? That can be part of the conversation. And finally, yes, this uncertainty, this change represents threats, yeah, but also opportunities for Europe to no longer be so complacent about its own security and its own defense, as France has been speaking about for a long time, and others. America's interests are in the Pacific, of course, for good reasons, because for America's hegemony or its power, that's where its threat is. But that's not necessarily the EU's threat, is it? So the last quick thing that I would like to say is that it is important for the EU to be clear about its interest in a world which is now more transactional, where traditional alliances or partnerships may not necessarily be the same, and where raw power is the dominant. And the question we would ask is that today there is a void in terms of leadership in the center. China has positioned itself and says, we will be, the more the world seems to be closed, we will be more open to everybody. We respect multi-alignment, and we want more, no less of it. So the question for the EU at this point in time is, does the EU have the courage to step onto the global stage in a leadership role commensurate with its role as an economic superpower?
It's a good question. Thank you very much. So let's move to Shanghai now, please.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is it like this way? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for CEDAW for having me. It's my first time here in Spain and in Barcelona. And the past days has been really fruitful and impressive. I'm enjoying it very much, and especially today with such a distinguished panel. We are here to talk about the Global South and international security. I suppose that is a recognition that China is part of the Global South, which I do agree. So I will start with the Russia-Ukraine war. How does China see this war? There's a lot of discussions. I mean, it's been 3 years since the war, and I suppose you already understand some of the existing perspectives. But what I like to say today is that this war is not only one of the greatest challenges to Europe, but it is also, I think, one of the greatest challenge to China's diplomacy. And I think this challenge involves many dimensions. But I think from a Chinese perspective, our view is mainly shaped by two dimensions or considerations: a moral dimension, or value dimension, and a geopolitical dimension. Okay, so of course, definitely there's a moral dimension, and on this dimension, I think China has made it very clear on different occasions that national sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected. The UN Charter and UN principles should be respected. This is because China is, a founding member of the United Nations, and it's also a member of the United Nations Security Council. So I think we have a responsibility to uphold the UN Charter and international law. But on top of that, I think we should also take into consideration of the geopolitical dimension when understanding China's perspective on this war. Because this war also poses a great challenge and involves China's relation with many great powers, in particular the United States, Russia, and of course Europe. And I think when it comes to the United States, it's the top agenda of China's foreign policy. Okay? And how to manage this so-called strategic competition with the United States. That is our top security concern at the moment. So it is not that we don't understand the Ukraine war is an existential threat to Europe, but it is that for us, there is another existential challenge. We need to manage this competition with the US. So I think this is feeds a lot into China's perspective on the war. And also, I mean, for China, Russia is an important neighbor and very important country, and it is very difficult for China to manage this relationship. We have to take into consideration that China is our neighbor with the longest border. Okay, so maintaining a stable relationship with Russia is particularly important in the context of a strategic competition with the United States. But of course, this war, our position is also shaped by our relations with our European partners. I think in this regard, we have to maintain a very delicate, approach and balanced approach between our relations with the US, with China, and also with Europe. And I think until now, I think most of Chinese scholars, we think we have tried our best to maintain a balanced approach. And so the second question, is this war a game changer in international security? Definitely yes. This war has fundamentally reshaped the international security environment. And I think from a Chinese perspective, I think there are three important changes that worth attention. The first change is the return of geopolitical blocs, and especially the military alliances. We see NATO was once called brain dead, and now is revived by the Russian-Ukraine war. NATO expanding, and NATO is also turning eastward into the Indo-Pacific region, which I think is a great concern for China as well. And also the second change that we should pay attention to is the risks of nuclear non-proliferation. We see that this war has encouraged some countries to seek nuclear weapons as as a fundamental guarantee of their security. And I think China has an important stake in this. And that's why China has also talked to Russia that nuclear weapons should not be used and nuclear war should not be fought. So I think this is kind of the red line for China in this war. And I think China should gain credit in that. I think also that's China's contribution to temper this war. Okay. And also, I think that another important change is the growing role of the global South in international security. We have seen that after this war broke out, there are, a lot of realignment in the international system. And also, we see global South countries, when the vote in the United Nations resolutions, they show a different or subtle difference in their position on this war. They don't want to be forced to choose sides. Okay? They want more autonomy in their foreign policy, right? And also, they are also criticizing the West for some sort of double standards because right now there's not just the Ukraine war, there are other wars happening in this world, in the Middle East and other regions. So the global South also wants to make their voices heard when it comes to international security. And I think somehow, according to my observation, these days in Spain, I think Spain is catching this trend. And I see a lot of discussions here on the global South and multilateralism, global South and international security, this kind of discussion we are having here today. I think that is very positive. So looking into the future, what would international security look like after the Ukraine war? Honestly, I don't know, but I think to conceive of international and European security architecture, in the future we have to think about some fundamental issues first, okay? Or fundamental questions. And in this regard, I think the first important question to think about is how to deal with Russia. I think that is the key for European and also to some degree international security architecture. It is a security with Russia or security without Russia. I don't have a position here, but I think Europeans should also start thinking about this question. Of course, currently, people in Europe is occupied with the ongoing war, but this debate should also happen now, okay? Not after the war ended. The second question to think about is how to deal with a US retreat. Okay? The US is turning to unilateralism and is retreating from the UN system somehow. So US used to be the provider and guarantor of this order, but now it is retreating, and then who is going to provide the leadership to guarantee international security? It is the EU, China, Global South. I think that's a fundamental issue we need to think about. And it is, I think, most possible that we are experiencing a process of multipolarization, well, in which leadership is not, just provided by the United States, but several, poles of several powers. And in this, I think Europe has an important role to play. Okay. But for that, I think Europe needs to step up its engagement and play a greater role in not just European security, but also international security. Okay. And I think in China, in the Global South, there are expectations from the EU. And I think in China, the EU has very good positive, image. We have very good perception for the European Union as kind of benign power in the international order. Okay. So I think we have high expectations from the European Union in that regard in providing leadership post-Ukraine crisis. And the last question to think about is how to balance security and development. And here I echo your point that security is not just about war, okay? It's also about development, especially for countries in the Global South. I mean, development is closely interlinked with security. And I think in this regard, China also gains credit for putting forward initiatives such as the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, which tries to address the root causes of instability and insecurity. And I think somehow the future of international security depends on which country, which group, who can provide a better vision for the Global South. And I conclude here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Last but not least, let's turn to South Africa, and then we will engage in the discussion. Please.
No, thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you, firstly, for the invite. I think I'll try to, sort of outline a few areas just for thought, maybe try to not go into some of the areas that the fellow panelists have discussed, but just a few points, right? So clearly the world is witnessing a change, right? But this is not something that begins now. It certainly precedes President Trump. It precedes the COVID-19 pandemic. But we have been witnessing a movement towards a multipolar world order, where countries within the global south are clearly playing a bigger role, not only in their own regions, but also globally. Within their regions, this is important because previously they were not able to play a more assertive role within their own regions. So countries, leading countries within the global south, are reshaping their own regions when it comes to development, systems of development, economic models adopted, governance models that lead within their own regions. And that movement towards a multipolar world order was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw challenges in supply chains. We saw challenges in terms of international solidarity, but we also witnessed an important shift within leading countries within the global south. Example in Africa. One of the things that the pandemic really exacerbated was to say there needs to be a serious movement towards self-reliance, towards an ability to create regional value chains within the African continent, beneficiate its minerals, and use its resources for development, right? So within that changing international order, the opportunity is not only for countries within the global south. The opportunity is also for Europe. And I think it is important that within the discourse in Europe, for Europeans to say, how can the European Union play a more assertive role in a multipolar world order? That will have an impact on security, on development, on economic relations, and a whole range of dimensions of international relations, right? But Europe has the ingredients to certainly be one of these significant poles in a multipolar world order. The challenge is at times Europe has seen a multipolar world order as almost like a threat, a challenge, to its authority. The reality is that that is not how it is seen in the global south. In fact, if anything, at least from the region I come from, a more assertive Europe would actually be welcome. A more assertive Europe that distinguishes itself from its very close transatlantic partner. I think we understand that there is a close relationship between Europe and the US. And I think there's nobody who would actually try to disrupt that. There is a clear understanding that this is a special relationship historically, perhaps even in contemporary times. Of course, there's disruptions to that relationship. However, it is important for Europe to assert itself more, distinguish itself from its key partner, which is the United States, so that in other parts of the world, when other regions of the global south look at the European Union, they look at the European Union as an entity, as a network of its own, not as an extension of US interests, because there are areas of convergence and areas of divergence, clearly. So I think this is quite important, right? As we speak, President Zelensky is in South Africa. He is concluding a state visit today. He was supposed to stay until Friday, but he's had to head back because of the shelling and some of the attacks, that have been happening today. So, but that is important. Why is it important? Why is it important for President Zelensky to actually be in a key African country? Well, it was important because we saw the response to the war in Ukraine. in Africa, most countries sought to say, we do not want to take a side. We do not want to support Russia. We do not want to support Ukraine. What we want to do is to understand the complexity of the war. We want to understand what are the root causes of the war and how can these root causes actually be solved. Now, I would not take some of that sentiment from Africa lightly. I mean, the continent is dealing with ongoing conflicts, right? If we go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, clearly one of the richest countries in the world, if not the richest country in the world, in terms of mineral resources, right? But also happens to be one of the poorest countries in the world. Inability to have a cohesive government that is able to exercise sovereignty over its territory and redistribute, the gains of those resources to its citizens. Okay, that war in the DRC since 1996 has cost over 6 million lives. 6 million. So now you can understand when Africans hear that, let's say the war in Ukraine is the biggest war since World War II, you can understand why some Africans look at that with a degree of skepticism. Not because that view does not have merits. Of course, the war in Ukraine is significant. The type of weapons that are being utilized, the types of great powers that are involved in it, it has a potential to escalate much further than perhaps, the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The war in Sudan, as in recent times, has killed over 150, according to some estimates, people. So you can understand when a country like South Africa, who has committed resources to resolving the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, has lost troops there as part of its peacekeeping mission, you can understand when it takes a particular position of non-alignment, right? It was criticized for that position of non-alignment, but it withstood, that criticism and said it does not want to choose between that side and that side. It is negatively impacted by the war in Ukraine. Food prices have gone up. Supply chains have been disrupted. The input costs for fertilizers, for farmers, especially fertilizers, have gone up. So the war in Ukraine is bad for Africa. It's bad for the global south, right? But what countries like South Africa have done, rather than siding with that side or that side, have basically said, how can we contribute to understanding the root causes of this war? And this is what led to South Africa leading a team of African heads of state to Russia and to Ukraine to speak to the respective sides and convey to them that this war is negative for Africa and is negative for the global south. However, it is not in Africa's interest to exacerbate the divisions by choosing one side over the other. Now, of course, that has also come with criticism, because some criticize South Africa for not condemning Russia, overtly condemning Russia. What South Africa has said is that it asserts the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It has also sought to say it condemns the use of force to resolve, political issues. But its response has been largely one based on principle, rather than trying to, take one side over the other. And of course, that has positives and it also may have negatives. But the very fact that President Zelensky thought it is important that he should go to South Africa and honor the invitation speaks to indeed a changing international landscape. I mean, when have we seen a group of African presidents going to Europe to speak with respective parties in Europe to try and understand, you know, the root causes of a conflict that is happening in Europe when Africa itself is dealing with serious conflicts? That in itself speaks to an important role for the global South and also for Africa in a changing international landscape. The last point is that when we talk about, so part of the reason why African countries have adopted a non-aligned position is because many of them see this conflict as a failure of the European security architecture, post-World War II security architecture. They see it as an escalation, you know, of tensions that have been escalating for a long time. And they do not see it as something that just begins, you know, let's say in 2014 in Crimea or in 2022, you know, when Russian tanks move across the border and the current phase of the war, you know, takes place. So many in Africa are saying Europe has to deal with its security architecture in order to find a long-lasting solution. And to deal with that European architecture, yes, there will have to be a form of condemnation towards, you know, towards Russia and the role that it has played, but also there needs to be a dealing with Russia, because Russia is not going anywhere. The reality is that Russia is here to stay. So how do you coexist with a country like Russia, which has voiced the type of views that it voices around the European security architecture? And Europe will have to be more assertive. Europe has to understand that in as much as the security umbrella that has been provided by the transatlantic partnership has been important, however, it is quite clear that there is no long-term guarantee that this security umbrella will actually be honored, you know, from Washington. Because some viewed the first Trump administration as a temporary thing. They viewed it as an anomaly. They viewed it as something that would just pass by. But the reality is that Trump and the sentiment that he represents has remained present within the United States. And if it remains present beyond the Trump administration, it is quite clear that Europe itself has to be more responsible for its own security. The last point is that Europe has a lot to offer in terms of development, in terms of soft power, but also in terms of material power. Europe has a lot to offer. And the hope is that what the second Trump administration will demonstrate, I think, to Europe is the need to play a more assertive role and for Europe to see itself as one of the leading poles in a multipolar world order, rather than seeing a multipolar world order as a threat. And to do that, Europe has to expand its relations with the global South. It has to enhance its own internal coordination. But at the same time, it also has to revisit some of the assumptions that it had about this transatlantic partnership. It will remain special, it will remain important, but certain assumptions need to be re-evaluated if there is going to be a long-lasting and sustainable peace in Ukraine, you know, that basically is not just a temporary fix. So let me stop there.
No, thank you very much. much. So thank you very much, the three of you, for this very enlightening first round of, and very complex round of discussions. I want to have some time for questions and answers from the audience. But let me make one point on what the three of you just said, which is basically this idea that there's an opportunity for Europe in this more multipolar world that we have entered or is already fully into motion. And Europe needs not to see this multipolarity as a threat, but rather as an opportunity, by making the best of multi-alignment for its own purposes, right? I think you all agree on this point. My question to you is that there seems to be also an understanding that current multipolarity is increasingly driven by the use or the threat of force, right? So multipolarity not defined as equal relations in a shared sort of international organizations and norms environment, but rather multipolarity seen as sort of a concert of nations or sort of a concert of great powers competing for shares of power. And this is where I would disagree a bit with your analysis when you say that Europe can play a role therein, right? Because this is precisely what Europe is very bad at doing, right? Or it doesn't want to go along those lines, because it is built against the very logics of power. So my question to you is there a way, and perhaps it's wishful thinking or just totally irrelevant question, is there a way to go back from this idea of multipolarity driven by power relations into multipolarity driven by norms and values again? And what would be that sort of new architecture that builds on those shared norms and values? Because there I think that perhaps Europe can play a role. But I'm very hesitant into the idea that Europe can play a role in that other world that you have described. So I don't know if that's a relevant question or not, but that was just to give time to the audience to think about their questions. I ask for 1 minute answers on this, if you like, and then I'll move to the audience. Who would like to address that?
I think what you've posed is very complex.
It is, probably. That's why we are lost in Europe. That's the problem.
And I don't necessarily think it's a binary choice either. Years ago, when I went to, I used to be a director for Rockefeller Foundation in the 90s, and I worked in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I was stunned at how European their history is. They're not going anywhere, you know. And what has struck me right now is not even the single track that you ask in one and another. There should surely be 2 tracks in terms of Europe's response to all of this. Where are the diplomats in Europe? I mean, if you want peace, regardless of what else is happening, as a diplomat, you send your diplomats. You can never not engage with the people that you want to bring to the table. So that is a question for you. I don't understand that. And I don't agree that it's a binary choice.
Excellent.
Okay?
Excellent input, yeah. Kilani, or
Okay,
would you like to say a few words?
I try to complement your argument. I think there's no fundamental contradictory between the 2 dimensions. I think underneath each, architecture, underneath the norms, values, and principles, there lies a power structure. And the current changes is largely due to the change of this power structure. As I just mentioned, I mean, the previous, architecture order was largely, provided by the United States, unipolar world, and now but that is a short-term phenomena. I mean, no country, can maintain this unipolar moment and provide, long-lasting leadership to the order. I think so. We need, adaptability, and in order to, maintain or uphold, those principles and order, you need power. So I think it's also time for Europe to rethink its, self-perception as a normative power. Maybe it's also time for Europe to become a normal power. I think they are not contradictory.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Philani, would you like to say
I
another
like the
word?
idea of Europe being a normative power and a normal power. Look, Europe gave us, concepts like realpolitik. Europe gave us concepts like raison d'être. Europe understands hard power. They understand its necessity, but they also understand the excesses of hard power. So Europe has a lot to remind, the world in terms of moving into an order that is purely driven by hard power, the use of force, and so on and so forth. So the European experience is a cautionary tale, but also Europe has something to share about the peace dividend that it enjoyed after, World War II. Some of this is being lost, is being forgotten, certainly, but I think Europe certainly can play a role in terms of both values, but also in terms of hard, power. I think the reality is that we live in a world where, yes, you must plan, you hope for the best, but you must also plan for the worst, unfortunately. And in that sense, I think Europe can adapt, its approach. Firstly, it's an economic power, Europe. It's a very strong economic power. It's also a strong, it's also a normative, power in a sense. But to safeguard that in an environment where you are re-evaluating the assumptions of the transatlantic partnership, it is important for Europe to also invest in its hard power. Otherwise, if it fails to do that, its normative power and its economic power become increasingly threatened. And especially because the assumption is that you become less reliant on the reliability of the transatlantic security in that sense. So I don't think this is necessarily contradictory. So even as, according to the European perspective, Europe may be seen or sees itself as a normative power. But I can tell you, in Africa, in other parts of the world, they don't only view Europe as a normative power. They also view Europe as a hard power. However, it might be a reluctant hard power. In the same way that for many years China was somewhat of a reluctant superpower, as some have called it. But to safeguard and to shape, this international order, it's important for European countries, especially European middle powers, to work closer with Global South middle powers in shaping an order that is both norm and values based. So I think many middle powers in Europe and middle powers in other parts of the world can agree on the centrality of the United Nations, can agree on the importance of rules, in shaping international trade and other areas. So use that, to shape the norms of an evolving international order, but also understand that you have to invest in your hard security power. And that means Europe playing a more active role in its own security.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me turn to the audience for the last section of our event. I'll gather, if there are more than one questions, a few of them, so that qui voldria preguntar? If questions that they can be, go to the end over there. Questions can be in English and Catalan or Spanish because there's translation, but let's see.
So thank you so much for our panelists. Like, it's really a pleasure to see how the Global South can teach Europe things, not the other way around, because I think that we have done that for too long and maybe not correctly. So this probably, building on what Len has said on these grievances that have been building up with vaccines, with maybe us teaching things on how the war in Ukraine needs to be done with Gaza. How can really the EU engage meaningfully with the Global South, taking into consideration that maybe in some parts, the Sahel, etc., Europeans are not longer seen as that benign power? And the second one, it's on food security, which is something that Villani has mentioned and Lan too. What role can also the EU play on trying to make food security something that it's put in the agenda back again on development too? Thank you.
Can we perhaps take another one? Erika over here at the very beginning. So I'll take these two.
Thank you very much. I just have
Maybe I will ask you to introduce yourselves. That was Inés Arco from CDOP, a researcher for China, Asia in general, and Erika.
America Rodriguez, the director of the Carolina Foundation. I'm an expert in Latin American affairs, but I would like to introduce a little bit of conflict between the panel, because I would like to ask you to you two if you agree with the idea of China being a part of the Global South. So, I think this is a discussion that we still need to have, and this is and I have a second question. Is about the structure of regional leadership, and it is necessary. Do you think it is necessary to have more stronger leaderships within regions, or we will see a regional multilateralism that is shaped or it will be addressed around ideas or around problems that they need, and so a more multilateral approach. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question is about the far. I'm Arnau Brassó. I'm a student, graduate student at the UPF and also at the Bay, searching for a PhD for now. And my question is about the far right, because all these talks about the changing international order are happening because there have been changes, domestic changes, national changes in the US, right? In the conservative far-right movement in the US. But Europe also has a strong far-right parties. And my question is, how would this Global South react in the future 15 years in the future Europe is dominated by these parties? In countries, very incontrovertible parties like France or Germany, because these far-right parties, I have been to some of their rallies online, and they are very, nationalistic. They have a very view of the past, of the colonial, imperial past that is, I think, very strong. So I don't know if in a very hypothetical but possible future, how will the Global South countries react to that?
Thank you. Very good questions. I'll keep this round first, and then maybe in the next round, so you can answer to any of. Should I follow the same order? Len, you go first.
Well, I mean, there's a question about the EU Global South relationship, in a sense, going forward. I think that in the same way that one has to understand perhaps root causes of the conflict in Russia, Ukraine, Europe, I think it's very important to understand as well that for the Global South countries, the matter of systemic inequality in all governance systems is something that they have been speaking about from the time that they were colonies. Then they became independent. Then they were part of NAM. In 1974, they tabled a resolution talking about a new international economic world order. That didn't go far, but it was part of a North-South report that was presided over by the president of the IMF and a number of eminent people that first started talking about two blocks, a North and a South, whether we like Global South or whatever. But we were already, from that point of view, talking about a North, two blocks. Now we more talk about a West and a Global South. Okay? But those type of systemic inequalities based on terms of trade that are very unfair, lack of access to raw materials within a country that is so materially rich and yet among the most underdeveloped in the world. Okay? Those issues have not gone away. And to come out of where we are right now in a coalition of the willing, in multilaterals or whatever we speak about, we are going to need to go back there and not build on what is existing. I'm not saying demolish it, but there's got to be a lot more by way of equity. And without equity, we're not going to go anywhere. Nowhere fast, at least. The rest of the world is going to go on and do what it's going to do and say to the West, when you're ready to meet us on equal terms or mutual respect, yes. Second quick thing I'll say about the Global South, China. China has never been, at least for me, and there are many different views, a member of the Global South, but it has always been an ally for a very, very long time. It was there at the first meetings of NAM. It was there in solidarity for every resolution that was tabled. It's supported all the way. When Tanzania was looking to build its first railroad, as it became independent to bring minerals to a port, it went to Washington and it asked for a loan. It was told, no, you're poor, you will never be able to pay it back. They went to the Commonwealth Secretariat. They were told, no. China built it, even though China said, but we're poor. We're as poor as you. China built it. Started in 68, it ended in 72, and it cost billions of dollars in today's currency. And they built it. There's something called solidarity. There's something called friendship. And this is part of the reason why China's development model, which does not interfere or preach. There is a saying in parts of Africa after Kamala Harris visited last year, that when the Americans come, and this has been broadcast, and I mean no harm by this, but there are lectures being given when the Chinese come, they build bridges, okay? That goes to the point that I was making earlier about the importance of development. And the last quick thing that I will say is that you've raised the question about minilaterals. Will they work? Is that where we're headed? Yes, but no region in the world is going to be able to solve climate change, okay? Or deal with trade that needs to be open so that people can prosper. So there is a role for minilaterals, but I would say that we still need people at the table to be able to work on global commons. And the last thing, to your question, what happens to Europe that is increasingly moving to the right? We find that in America as well. Because even in mature Western democracies, there is a segment of the population that's saying quite loudly or questioning if democracy is working for them. And quite often they're thinking it's not. I'm not saying that I have any clue as to what replaces it, but these are fundamental questions, and the Pew poll that's been done every year on degrees of freedom, but also how people view democracy. Every single year, mature societies, mature Western liberal societies, segments within them, increasingly every year are polling lower and lower rates of confidence in their governments and in their systems of governance to deal with issues that are important to them. And inequality in all of these societies, all of our societies, is increasing. It's not going down.
Jan, would you like to say a few words as well?
I suppose I have a question on whether China should be included as a member of the Global South. Okay? It seems I made a trouble for myself because I mentioned this in the beginning, and I would like to clarify a little bit more, and you have helped me shed light on that, but I will add something more. I think yes. I mean, maybe I should ask you how you define the Global South first, because fundamentally this is a very broad, kind of ambiguous concept, but I do think there are a lot of common grounds between China and the global south. We have a shared history of colonialism, and that has a bearing on, on their policies and their memories, etc. Right? If you look at the foreign policy behavior of China and global south in multilateral settings in the United Nations, you see a lot of shared patterns in their voting behavior. If you look at, and also their focus, China has a strong focus on development, okay? A strong focus on the global south in Africa, nowadays in Latin America, Central Asia, etc. And also, I think this leads me to Ines' question about how to engage meaningfully with the global south for the European Union. I think it makes a lot of sense for the EU and China to, and also to bring in the global south in their bilateral engagement, because China is a very important and active player in engaging with the global south, and especially in the context of US withdrawal from, at least from the development aid, right? I think that makes China and EU a very important partner in engaging in, at least in the area of development aid in the global south. Okay.
Philani, would you like to also add something on this?
Yeah, just very briefly. I like the focus also on, let's say, the food security dimension, because I think we've seen in the last couple of years the commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals falling behind. Increasingly, world headlines, the global discourse is about war, it's about power, it's about, and what falls behind is development goals. And we've seen that this has indeed been the case, and we have lost ground in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Africa has 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. That's significant. It also has abundance of fresh water resources, never mind, minerals and others. Now, this is a great opportunity for cooperation between Europe and Africa. Not only between Europe and Africa, but also, countries like China and other countries. I mean, but to do that, there also needs to be a re-evaluation of how Europe can work with, African countries in terms of cultivating that arable land, right? And not seeing it as necessarily a threat to the European market. So it has to relook also at its trade policies, phytosanitary measures. It also has to see it as an opportunity, I think, also for European farmers to work with African farmers as an investment, a long-term investment, to building up food security, but there's a commercial dimension to that. I mean, if European farmers are working with African farmers to cultivate that land, the geographic centrality of Africa in terms of other parts of the world, massive export, into Asia and into other parts of the world, and that's a win-win relationship. So there's a clear role to play there. Part of the reason why, I think, let me just talk about Africa. Part of the reasons why African countries at times admire, China's development over the last couple of decades, right, is because many of them see China as a global south country that has shown what is possible in terms of development, right? I am pretty sure most African countries know that they cannot replicate the Chinese model of development. But if something that we've learned from China is that it's not about imposing a particular model or system of governance on another country. You can't replicate what China has done. But what we can learn from China is that your development model has to be based on your own history, culture, context, you know, and this is something that is important. So I think that's part of the reason why many actually do admire what they have seen, you know, from China over the last couple of years, and that creates some type of soft power. And remember that China's, taking its seat in the UN Security Council, Africa had a huge role to play there. The votes that Africa gave, you know, to China, for China to, to take its seat on the Security Council rather than Taiwan, a big part of that was Africa's role to play. So there is that strong, you know, history, I think. And I think many do see China as part of the global south, whether it's an ally of the global south or part, but certainly China sees itself as part of the global south. And I think the global south is not going to say, hey, you're not part of us, you know. So I think that's quite important. If the far right continues to grow, definitely we're going to see more fragmentation. We're going to see more narrow nationalism. And we're going to see a fragmented global order where you have multiple, you know, orders, essentially. But also, I think what it will do is it will perhaps foster even a greater sense of self-reliance within the global south. There may be pragmatism in terms of trade and in other areas, but it will be quite clear that the commitments to development, to solidarity, and other values will decline, you know, in leading countries, you know, in Europe and also in the United States. We've seen it. US has cut 83% of its aid. It's slashing a lot of embassies across Africa. It's seeing Africa in a very narrow sense about access to critical minerals, no solidarity and all of that. So this is the type of order we will see. But that will boost relations amongst the global south, and it will also boost regional integration, in my view. One of the strengths about regional integration is that it acts as a buffer to narrow nationalism. You know, in Africa, I think there's a realization that for Africa to play its role in the world, it cannot do it as 54 individual countries. It's just not going to be possible. It has to agree to coalesce around certain policy issues. So if Africa is to enhance its agency, then it has to increase interconnectivity within Africa. It has to increase trade within Africa. And that is what is going to guarantee Africa's future. So Africa's future will be guaranteed not so much about just what happens in international affairs, but it will be guaranteed by its own ability to enhance its own, you know, opportunities and its own resources. So regional integration is going to be very, very important, at least for regions such as Africa, who see themselves as being stronger when they work together rather than as 54 individual countries.
Okay, we've run out of time, but we started a few minutes late, so I will give 5 minutes until the end of this event. So this means very short questions with very short answers. I see I had one here in the first round that I decided not to take in the first round, so please, and then I'll move there, and that's it. Go ahead.
I was very happy to listen from the South, encouraging Europe to become pole. But my question is, how are the state of the wounds caused on the past by Europe, for instance, in China, the century of the humiliation committed by us, the Europeans, no? Opium wars, etc. The state of the wounds today to see Europe as a potential pole. Africa, I don't want even say about it, because it's shame on Europe, basically. And then there is no South American here representing the panel, but also in South America. So the same thing. So my question is to whoever in the panel wants to answer, how is the state of the wound? Still bleeding? Are you really encouraging us to be leading? Is that all forgotten? What is the situation? A comment. I know the answer is long, no? But
In the front, I will need you to be very short, and I will end with you, okay?
Okay, I'm Carmen Claudine, CDOP associate researcher. I wanted to make a comment, but our director doesn't allow us because we do not have time. So the comment, I will make it maybe later on if we can, about the root causes of the war, because I'm always struck. Nothing to do with lack of diplomacy relationship, by the way, Lina, nothing. I'm always struck by the fact that our African colleagues do not see, with their familiarity with the colonialism reality, the root cause of Ukraine's war being like, hopefully, the last episode of a decolonization dynamic between Russia and its neighbors. But my question is for our Chinese colleague regarding also Russia and China relationship. Filani has even foreseen the possibility of a post-Trump, and that probably half of the United States will stay the same, even without Trump. Is China foreseeing or preparing itself for a past Putin? And what kind of scenarios do they foresee? Because this past Putin is absolutely unclear in what direction it will go, either more illiberal or not.
Please, right in the front, and then I will end with this. And you don't have to answer to all of the questions. You can choose, pick and choose, please.
I will be very, very quick. To my analysis, I think that democracy is receding right now, and it's losing its prestige as a successful political system, because we are seeing many countries which are non-democratic, and they are being regional and even global powers. So do you think that the European Union, if it survives its far-right wave, can be a leading role in democracy, in giving democratic values to other countries?
Over here, at the, right in the front. Please, last word is for you.
Thank you very much. My name is Wei Shen. I'm a Jean Monnet Chair Professor from Zhejiang University, which is the home of DeepSeek. You probably have heard about that. And my question is related to the EU-China collaboration in the post, I don't know, the US, withdrawal. I think that's the reality we're seeing. Recently in Indonesia, the US aid, a lot of grants are removed. So EU-China collaboration in the Global South has been on the agenda for a long time, but there's a great suspicion, probably a lot from the European side. And as you know, EU calls China partner, competitor, but also systemic rivalry. And yesterday we were in Madrid, and the president of CDOP, Josep Borrelli, talked about that because we have factual difference between EU and China, that's why we are systemic rivalry. So how EU and China can work together in Global South from your perspective? Because of the factual difference, can we still work together? Do you have some concrete suggestions for EU-China partnership working together for Global South as US is moving away from its aid and development assistance? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good questions. Can I follow the reverse order now, and then we end with Len?
Yeah, no, very briefly, the wounds are still there, but if you did a poll in many African countries, is Europe still an attractive, area, still an attractive destination? The answer would be yes. I mean, Europe has managed to, with all its problems over the last, couple of decades, it's managed to have a real balance in terms of work-life balance, in terms of producing systems of governance that provide welfare for their own citizens. That is attractive, I think. And that means that there is an area of cooperation between, you know, Africa, for instance, and Europe, in terms of not replicating, but in terms of ensuring that Africa can also build systems of governance that are able to benefit its own citizens. So I think in as much as China is attractive for its development over the past couple of decades, Europe is also attractive, you know, partly because of that. It's not about it being forgotten, but in fact, Africans are saying we would like to see Europe, not as an extension of the United States. You know, and that is a great opportunity, I think, for Europe. But the approach from Europe has to be slightly different on certain areas. At times, Europe is seen as interfering in the domestic affairs of African countries, at times utilizing democracy as part of that. Now, if you poll most Africans, they support democracy. They definitely do support democracy. But also what they do not like is the idea that others tell them at what pace they should move, how they should do it. You know, South Africa's democracy is very different to, you know, other countries. You know, it recognizes traditional leadership and so on and so forth, right? So there are different ways, and I think what Europe can do is work with African countries to support their governance systems, strengthen their governance system so that states are able to provide, you know, for their own citizens. So rather than preaching or being seen as preaching, you know, it's about saying, what are you doing and how can we work with you to actually increase and improve what you are already doing.
Thank you very much, Vianney. Jan?
Okay, very short answer, okay. Whether China is prepared for a post-Putin. I think whoever sits in the Kremlin, we need to, you know, maintain a stable relationship with Russia, whether it is a Putin's Russia, or more liberal Russia, or other Russia. I mean, the fact is Russia is important neighbor for China, and we need a stable neighborhood for China's development. So we are always prepared to maintain a stable relationship with our neighbor.
Is the Ukraine war a decolonization war as well, as Carmen suggested? Can we refer to the war in Ukraine as something related to the decolonization process as well? Is that something that would resonate?
What's the question, sorry?
Carmen questioned whether we should understand also the war in Ukraine as an effort for Ukraine to end its decolonization from Russia. That was the question. Is that something that would be a reasonable thinking on the war in Ukraine, or it's a bad idea to frame the war?
Well, yeah, it's difficult. I mean, what do you mean by decolonization? I think this has a very particular historical background to use the term decolonization, so I wouldn't frame it like that.
Thanks. Len, last word for you.
I'm not sure that Russia would consider that the framing of this particular conflict is one based on decolonization, right? They would, I'm pretty sure, consider that the roots are maybe 60 years ago. Just a couple of quick things. Have the wounds gone away? No. I don't think the wounds will ever go away, but what countries are, even Caribbean countries, Latin American countries, are asking to be treated with mutual respect and dignity in any approach. And that has to be part of what we take going forward. What does democracy mean? You know, it's turning out that there are many different views of what democracy means. I don't believe anymore that there's one unilateral view of what democracy brings with it. And certainly when we speak with our friends, whether it's Latin America or Africa, we can't forget how important culture is. When Europe in the Age of Enlightenment, colonized about 84% of the rest of the world, what they did was to spread their culture and their institutions, sometimes unfittingly on indigenous people. This matter of culture is one which is yet to be taken care of in the narrative going forward. And the last quick thing that I would say, is there space for the EU and China to cooperate? My own personal view is that it's always been a mistake when Europe, for example, in unveiling the Global Gateway, President of the Commission said, we're doing this, it's us and it's them, you know, and this is our competition. You can't compete with the Belt and Road Initiative from 2013, which is more than $1.2 trillion worth of investments. But even beyond that, the rest of the world is offended by any notion of us or them, because it denies the sovereignty of countries to choose their partners, and it denies the rights of their own interest. One of the things that I've always advocated in my taking a look at EU policies to EU friends and colleagues, and documented it in reports that I've given back, why the need for competition in Africa or in Latin America? If it is that development is that important, why don't we consider development as a zone of cooperation? It doesn't have to be about competition.
Excellent. This was very, very rich discussion. I would like to thank you very much and the audience for engaging in this, and I'm sure there will be a lot more to follow. So thanks for being here.